Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail into some seriously weird waters. Not for buried treasure, but for something way rarer. Functioning healthcare. That's right, we're diving into the shadowy, cannon-blasted world of pirates. And how, despite being drunk, dirty, and wanted in 12 colonies, they somehow managed to take better care of each other than most medieval kings took care of their own armies. You're about to meet bandits who could stitch a man's gut back together mid-storm, crews that offer disability pay, and doctors whose only qualifications were surviving syphilis more than once. Oh, and you might want to brace yourself, because if you thought your HMO was bad, wait until you hear about what medieval royalty passed off as healing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and what weird corner of the world are you listening from? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with the basics. Picture this. The Caribbean sun is blazing, the salt air is stinging, and your ship just got boarded by men who haven't bathed in 3 months. There's blood on the deck, your leg is halfway hanging off, and someone hands you a saw. Welcome to pirate medicine. But hold on, this isn't chaos. Not exactly. Because for all their rum-swigging madness, pirates developed a surprisingly organized system of medical care. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't sterile, but it was efficient, communal, and, compared to medieval standards, shockingly humane. Let's start with what they had on hand. A pirate ship's medical kit usually contained asterisk a bone saw, for obvious reasons, asterisk a cautery iron, for stopping the bleeding, asterisk linen strips, not always clean, but hey, asterisk a bunch of sharp knives, asterisk a bottle of rum, the magical cure-all. Some pirate surgeons carried a wooden chest about the size of a toolbox, filled with instruments that looked like medieval torture devices. And, to be fair, they kinda were. Forceps to yank teeth, trocars to drain fluid, needles thick enough to sew sails. And here's the twist. Most of these tools were the exact same ones used by European military surgeons. Only pirates didn't charge you for bleeding out on them. Medieval kings, by contrast, relied on royal physicians who followed theories more than evidence. You've got a fever? Better bleed you with leeches and chant in Latin. Pirate surgeons? Your arms off? Drink this rum. Bite down. I'm sawing. It's rough, but it worked. And here's the kicker. Being injured on a pirate ship didn't mean being tossed overboard. Many pirate crews had written codes, sometimes called Articles of Agreement, that guaranteed compensation for wounded crewmates. Lose a leg? That could earn you 600 pieces of 8. Lose an eye? Maybe 100. That's not just kindness. That's HR. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, if you were a peasant soldier and your arm got lopped off by a mace, your thank you was usually a pat on the head and a shallow grave. Pirates somehow had benefits. Historians still argue whether these medical codes were widespread across all crews or limited to more democratic outfits like those of Bartholomew Roberts or Black Bart. But the records we do have, including logs, confessions, and naval reports, suggest that pirates treated injury as a shared crisis, not personal failure. And it wasn't just reactive. Some pirate ships had designated medical personnel. Not always trained, sure. Sometimes it was just the ship's cook who had steady hands. But the point is, they tried. Kings sometimes left their wounded to rot if the moon wasn't the right phase. Let's not romanticize it, though. Pirate medicine still involved a lot of alcohol, yelling, and stuffing wounds with whatever wasn't nailed down. But it had a kind of rugged honor code behind it. A brutal recognition that every crew member mattered, even if half of them smelled like dead squid. There's a haunting kind of logic in all this. When you're adrift in the middle of the sea with no backup, You either take care of your people or you all die together. Unlike royal courts, where you could just blame the barber surgeon and get another serf, pirates didn't have that luxury. Their loyalty and their lives were held together by bandages and rum. And that's just a start. Backslash. You'd think losing a leg in the 1700s would be the end of a pirate's career, or at least their swagger. But oddly enough, for many pirates, it was just the beginning of their benefits package. Let's talk pirate disability compensation. Yes, really, unlike most navies or medieval armies, pirate crews weren't just violent mobs stabbing each other for treasure. They had rules, codified ones. And tucked into those rules were cold, hard numbers for how much you get paid if your arm, leg, eye, or hand got mangled during service. For example, asterisk lose a right arm, around 600 to 800 pieces of 8. Asterisk lose a left leg, 400 to 500, depending on rank and whether it happened during a fight or just tripping over cannonballs. Asterisk an eye, not worth as much, 100 to 150. Sorry, depth perception. That's not just lore. That's documented in various ship agreements recovered from trials and depositions. Like those of Henry Morgan and Edward Lowe, these weren't pirate myths. These were pirate contracts. And you know what's wild? These kind of injury payouts were more than most European kings gave their own soldiers, many of whom were lucky to be paid at all. One medieval knight might die anonymously in a siege, while a pirate with a missing foot was sipping grog and cashing in. Why such generosity? Because pirates were capitalists of the weirdest sort. They invested in each other. Every crew member was a financial asset, trained, experienced, and brutally irreplaceable. If someone got hurt, you didn't want them dying out of spite. You wanted them sticking around, helping run the rigging or shout intimidating threats while propped up on a barrel. Also, compensation helped maintain crew morale. If you knew the gang would take care of you, even after you caught a cannonball with your femur, you'd fight harder. Compare that to medieval levies. Peasants conscripted into war with the promise of vague honor, a crust of bread, and a grave. Guess who fought more willingly? Historians still argue whether these pirate compensation systems were based on earlier maritime codes, like those used by privateers or merchant vessels, or whether they developed independently. Either way, the pirates made them more democratic. The payouts were often voted on by the crew, with an actual tally of what your missing body part was worth. Now, did this make pirates more ethical than kings? Not quite. They were still pirates. But it did mean that if you limped into the gun deck, bleeding and concussed, you didn't just get pity, you got paid. And let's not skip over the prosthetic situation. If you think pirate peg legs and hook hands are just movie gimmicks, think again. They existed, and they served real function. Peg legs were often carved by ship carpenters, customized to the pirate's height and gait. Some even had interchangeable pegs for ship versus land walking. Seriously, early pirate modular design. Hooks? Not common, but occasionally fashioned from metal scraps or broken tools. These weren't elegant, and they definitely weren't OSHA certified, but they let a pirate keep working, keep threatening, and, let's be honest, keep their image alive. A guy with one eye, one leg, and one hand still manning a cannon? That's branding. And if a crew member couldn't return to active pirating, sometimes they became shipboard support. Cooks, quartermasters, lookout duty, or, more often than you'd expect, musicians. No joke. Sea shanties weren't just entertainment. They were a full-blown mental health initiative. And if you only had one lung, a cracked jaw, and a peg leg, playing fiddle was still an option. Let's not pretend this was a utopia. Pirate healthcare wasn't kind, but it was fairer than most state-sponsored military systems of the time, especially for common sailors. Kings saw their soldiers as expendable. Pirates saw their crewmates as profit-sharing partners with open wounds. This is where the pirate articles, crew constitutions, really shine. One article from Captain George Lowther's ship read, "If any man shall lose a limb or become otherwise maimed in the service, he shall receive 800 pieces of 8 out of the common stock, and shall remain with the company as long as he shall think fit." Translation: if you get wrecked while doing your job, you're not fired, you're funded. Now compare that to medieval serfs. Break an ankle plowing the Lord's fields? No gold, no pension, no help. Just your cousin asking if they can keep your boots. The pirate system, brutal and makeshift though it was, recognized something oddly human. If you want loyalty, you have to invest in your people, even if those people are drunk, loud, and screaming sea shanties about goats. And they knew it, too. Pirate journals and confessions show a real pride in how they handled their wounded. It wasn't a weakness. It was a badge. You didn't just survive. You earned your scars. Next time someone jokes about pirates being nothing but rum-soaked criminals with scurvy and scabbards, remind them, these guys had disability coverage before most governments had indoor plumbing. So now your leg's been blown off by a cannonball, and you've been paid 600 silver coins, fitted with a peg leg, and promoted to sea shanty specialist. Great. But what happens when your tooth starts screaming at 3 a.m.? Welcome to pirate dentistry, also known as yank it or drink until it stops hurting. Let's be clear. Toothaches were borderline fatal back then. Infections, abscesses, and jaw rot could kill you slowly and stinkily. On land, you might have access to a barber surgeon, a monastery infirmary, or some poor soul with pliers and very little training. At sea, you had a crewmate with strong arms and poor judgment. Yet somehow, this chaotic setup was still better than what many kings' own soldiers received. See, medieval and early modern Europe still operated on the four humors theory, where bad teeth were caused by too much phlegm or an imbalance in bile. Treatment options included bloodletting, chanting prayers, or placing a dead mouse against your gums. No, really, mice, freshly dead ones. Pirates, being a bit more pragmatic, skipped the mystical rodent applications and got straight to the point. If it hurt, take it out. No second opinions. No spiritual reckoning. Just grip and rip. The tools of the trade? A pair of metal pincers, a steady grip, and someone to sit on you. Now, here's the ironic part. This unsophisticated system actually worked, because pirates accidentally embraced a basic surgical truth. Stop the source of infection before it spreads. Whereas royal physicians might fiddle with poultices in Latin, pirates grabbed the tooth and ended the problem. Historians still argue whether this direct, brutal approach resulted in better long-term outcomes, but there's mounting evidence that pirate crews had lower mortality rates from minor infections than many standing armies did. A swollen gum in Henry V's army might turn into a brain infection. On a pirate ship, it was a 5-minute horror show followed by a drink. Of course, there were risks. Improper extractions could cause nerve damage, shattered teeth, or the kind of screaming that made the cook weep. That's why many pirate ships tried to appoint someone semi-competent as a medical go-to. Sometimes it was a former military medic. Other times, it was just a guy who once sewed a cat back together and didn't faint. And it wasn't just teeth. Pirate doctors performed trepanation, the act of drilling into someone's skull to relieve pressure, treat headaches, or let out the bad spirits. It's horrifying, yes, but medieval physicians were doing the same thing, just in fancy robes. The pirates at least used alcohol for anesthesia. Sometimes, we have records of shipboard trepanation happening with asterisk a flathead screwdriver, asterisk a heated dagger tip, asterisk the rim of a broken tankard. Don't ask. Painful? Absolutely. But compared to being bled out by a court physician using leeches he stored in a sock drawer, arguably more effective. And yes, rum was the ultimate pirate anesthetic. It numbed the pain, distracted the mind, and occasionally killed you, which also solved the pain. It's not ideal, but it was honest. No one on a pirate ship pretended they had a cure-all salve blessed by Saint Sebastian. You got what you got, and if you screamed less than the last guy, you earned bragging rights. Let's not forget the psychological side. Pirates knew they'd face injuries, infections, and broken bones, so they prepared for it culturally. Wounds weren't shameful, they were status. Losing a few teeth just made your scowl more convincing. Compare that to medieval courts, where aristocrats covered disease with makeup, wigs, and heavily censored records. Kings literally died of infected wounds while their surgeons held astrology charts. Pirates? They held you down, counted to 3, and hoped you didn't bite off someone's finger. And somehow that worked. Fringe tidbit? Some pirate surgeons used gunpowder mixed with brandy to sterilize wounds. Not recommended today, but it did kill bacteria, or at least anything alive in the area. In contrast, European royal medics often caused more infections than they cured. They rarely washed their hands, reused instruments between patients, and believed pus was a good sign. Spoiler, it wasn't. In the pirate world, if you survived an extraction or a skull hole, you were celebrated. Stories were told. Nicknames were earned. You became Skullcap Joe or One-Eyed Pete or Asterisk, that guy who headbutt the barrel. Asterisk. And while many of these guys probably died young, so did royal knights and city guards. The difference? Pirates died with hazard pay, personalized prosthetics, and fewer illusions. So the next time someone says pirates were filthy animals with no idea of medicine, just remember, while they were pulling infected teeth with bar tools, kings were still praying over leeches and bleeding out their favorite horse. All right, let's talk about the real MVP of pirate healthcare, rum. Not just a party drink, not just for toasting buried treasure. Rum was a pirate's ibuprofen, NyQuil, hand sanitizer, disinfectant, mouthwash, and sometimes breakfast. It was medicinal, ritualistic, and absolutely overused, but in many ways, it was the duct tape of the 18th century see doctor's kit. Let's set the scene. You've just been stabbed in the thigh by a splinter the size of a small sword. You're not dead, yet, but your leg looks like a crime scene and smells like wet salt pork. You know what happens next? Someone hands you a jug of rum. Then they light a fire. You're about to get cauterized. Pirate medicine, remember, wasn't about subtlety. It was about not dying immediately. And rum helped in 2 big ways. 1, internally, numb pain, slowed shock helped sleep. 2, externally, sterilized wounds, kind of scare bacteria, maybe. Smelled better than pus. Alcohol kills bacteria. Rum, with its high proof, was better than nothing, and pirates knew it. They didn't always understand the science, but they understood that a wound soaked in rum festered less than one wrapped in raw fish skin or religious guilt. But let's be honest, it wasn't just used wisely. Pirates drank constantly. Rum wasn't just medicine, it was morale. It was issued daily, sometimes as part of contract. Some ships even had rum allowances written into their pirate codes. Sailors expected it like wages, or like emotional support in liquid form. This led to some fantastic logic. If you broke your nose in a bar fight, rum. Got food poisoning, rum. Bitten by a rat, rum. Had an existential crisis at sea after watching your best friend fall into a shark's mouth, double rum. In other words, pirate ships were floating therapy sessions with weapons and ethanol. Now compare that to the medical cocktails served in medieval royal courts. Many cures involved. Asterisk powdered gold does not cure anything. Asterisk mercury actually speeds up dying. Asterisk ground mummy, yes, actual corpses. Asterisk leeches, again with the leeches. Kings were being treated with ancient alchemy, while pirates were accidentally inventing trauma-informed care with shots of rum and group singing. One approach had wigs. The other had results. Historians still argue whether the liberal use of rum did more harm than good long-term, especially with liver failure and drunken accidents. But short-term, it saved lives. It dulled pain. And it gave people the courage to get sewn up with sail thread in a thunderstorm. One fringe practice worth mentioning: wound whiskey. Pirates sometimes poured alcohol into wounds while sewing them shut, not just on the surface. It stung, yes. Screaming was involved. But it killed bacteria, or at least kept the wound from becoming a buffet for seaborne infections. Compare this to medieval land medicine, where your average battlefield surgeon might reuse a bloody knife for 6 amputations in a row, then wipe it on his apron and call it clean. Germ theory didn't exist, and neither did accountability. Pirates, meanwhile, understood, through sheer lived experience, that rum worked better than guessing. Even their healers, often failed surgeons, drunk monks, or half-sober cooks, knew to clean blades and alcohol between uses. They didn't always succeed, but they tried. And trying was half the miracle. And let's not skip the psychological angle. Rum was also how pirates braced for pain. They didn't have anesthesia, but they had community. Picture this. You're about to have your arms stitched back together. You're surrounded by shipmates. One holds your head. Another cracks a joke. Someone else sings a shanty, so off-key it distracts from the sound of flesh being sewn. And someone always keeps the rum coming. That sense of support, pain management, and community ritual, that's pre-modern palliative care, folks. A floating ER with group therapy and no copay. And it was cheaper than royal health care. Monarchs funded massive medical entourages with personal astrologers, spiritual advisors, and surgeons who once operated on sheep. Their success rate? Not great. Meanwhile, pirates were using second-hand rum, leftover thread, and collective willpower to survive literal explosions. Of course, pirates sometimes overdid it. Too much rum could lead to accidents, infections, and forgetting where you buried your own leg. But in moderation and in the absence of other options, rum saved more lives than many medieval textbooks ever did. The next time someone tells you pirates were just reckless drunks, remind them. Kings bled people to death with leeches while pirates sterilized wounds with distilled sugarcane fire. Who's the real innovator? And if you're wondering what happened to pirates too drunk to heal, well, some of them became the ship's doctors. But we'll get to that next. So here you are, bleeding from the forehead, possibly concussed, clutching your side like it's about to fall off, and screaming, "Where's the doctor?" on a pirate ship. The answer? He's the guy who just finished gutting a fish. Welcome to the strange and terrifying world of the pirate ship surgeon, who often wasn't a surgeon at all. In an ideal world, every pirate crew would have a trained medical professional on board. Someone with a background in battlefield medicine, surgical training, and a solid understanding of which liquids were drinkable and which were lamp oil. But in reality, the doctor was often just a least squeamish guy with a sharp knife and steady hands. Let's be clear, actual trained surgeons were rare, especially ones willing to associate with pirates. But every now and then, a real physician, or at least a disgraced one, would sign on, usually after being chased out of polite society for something like grave robbing, malpractice, or political slander. And the pirates didn't care. If you could stitch a man's belly closed after it had been open like a sack of grain, you were hired. But most of the time, the role of ship surgeon went to someone who, asterisk, used to be a barber. They were expected to know minor surgery. Asterisk had experience butchering animals. Asterisk once removed their own splinter and lived to brag about it. Asterisk owned a box of shiny metal tools and lied confidently. In short, credentials optional. One infamous example, the doctor aboard Blackbeard's ship was rumored to be a former cooper, a barrel maker, who had simply watched someone perform an amputation once and decided, how hard could it be? Spoiler, it was very hard. But he didn't die during his first try. So the crew promoted him. Meritocracy, pirate style. Yet strangely, even with this chaotic credentialing process, these makeshift surgeons often got the job done. Why? Because they learned by necessity. The sea was an unforgiving tutor. When every day brought injuries from cannon fire, splinter sword fights, and drunken falls from rigging, you learned fast, or your crewmates found a new doctor. And unlike many court physicians who clung to outdated theories and astrology charts, pirate surgeons were results-oriented. You didn't keep your job unless your patient walked again, or at least stopped leaking. Historians still argue whether pirates' untrained practitioners were statistically more effective than licensed medieval doctors. But we do know this. Pirates lived long enough to develop reputation-based medicine, meaning the guy who saved 3 lives got more trust than the guy with letters from Oxford. Let's talk about the tools. The surgeon's chest, if he had one, looked like a torture starter pack. Asterisk bone saws, asterisk cautery irons, asterisk forceps, asterisk suturing needles the size of knitting hooks, asterisk scalpel-like knives, asterisk vials of alcohol for both patient and surgeon, asterisk occasionally opium or laudanum if they were very lucky. But in most cases, it wasn't about the tools, it was about improvisation. No antiseptics, use salt water. No stitching thread, strip sailcloth. No bandages, rags, linen, or the ship's flag if morale was high and your surgeon had dramatic flair. And while medieval kings had court physicians dressed in velvet and ruffles, pirates had shirtless men yelling, "Hold him down," while digging musket balls out of shoulders with a spoon. Guess which one had a better survival rate? Fringe fact. Some pirate ships use animal fat mixed with herbs as a healing balm. It sounds disgusting, and it was, but certain combinations like rosemary and tallow had mild antibacterial properties. It was gross science, but it was science, of course. The flip side of all this DIY surgery was the very real chance of failure. Many operations resulted in death, especially when done mid-storm, mid-battle, or mid-hangover. But pirates, unlike kings, accepted death as part of the deal, not something to hide behind flowery obituaries. And when a pirate surgeon messed up, oh, they heard about it, loudly, possibly with threats. There were no malpractice lawsuits, just very pointy performance reviews. The pirate approach to medicine wasn't kind, but it was merit-based in a way that royal systems weren't. Kings hired doctors based on family name, not results. Pirates hired based on whether you could stitch someone's face back together during a thunderstorm. Also, pirates were better at admitting failure. If someone died, they didn't call it the will of God or excess bile. They called it the doctor slipped, buried a guy at sea, and poured one out. Ironically, this brutal honesty made their system more accountable. You couldn't hide incompetence at sea. Your patients were also your roommates, drinking buddies, and sword-wielding co-workers. If you failed them, you didn't just lose reputation. You might lose teeth. And yet, despite all this chaos pirate medicine endured, not because it was perfect, but because it worked just enough to keep the crew afloat and terrified enemies who assumed they were too wounded to keep fighting. Remember, these were men held together by rum, rope, and occasional miracle, and yet they managed to provide trauma care more consistently than many land-based hospitals of the era. Which begs a question. If you had to choose between being injured on a royal battlefield or a pirate ship, you'd probably pick the guy with the spoon and the flag. By now, you've had your arm sawn off, your tooth pulled with tongs, and your wound baptized in rum. You're battered, stitched, possibly on your second peg leg. But you're alive. Congrats. Now let's talk about the silent killer that took down more pirates than cannonballs ever did. Scurvy. If there's one thing that made entire pirate crews crumble into malnourished piles of grumpy bones, It was vitamin C deficiency. Scurvy was the great equalizer. The disease that didn't care how much gold you had, how sharp your cutlass was, or how many tavern songs were written about you. And yet, here's the twist. Pirates eventually figured out how to fight it, long before many European navies or royal courts did. Let's back up. Scurvy symptoms start small. Fatigue, irritability, bleeding gums. Then your teeth start falling out, your wounds reopen, your hair dries up, and your body literally begins unraveling from the inside like a cursed mummy. Not a vibe. And on ships, it could wipe out half a crew in weeks. Early medical authorities? Useless. Most medieval kings and physicians had no idea what caused it. Theories range from bad air to excess black bile to classic God's punishment for impure thoughts. And their treatments? Spoiler alert, they did not include vitamin C. Now pirates, unlike kings, had a slightly better shot at surviving it, not because they understood vitamins, but because they were opportunistic and observant. They noticed that eating fresh fruits and certain plants kept sailors alive longer. And when they raided ports in the Caribbean or South America, they'd often grab barrels of citrus, leafy greens, or anything vaguely plant-based, partly for taste, partly for survival, and partly because they didn't want to die coughing up their own gums. This led to the citrus revolution at sea, a not-so-coordinated pirate discovery that lemons and limes were essentially gold in fruit form. Fringe fact, in some ships, citrus was more prized than rum. You could trade an orange for a decent knife. A lemon? That might buy you a night of not being assigned to swab the deck. Meanwhile, back in Europe, many royal fleets continued to ignore scurvy well into the 18th century. One French naval officer famously died clutching a bag of pickled eels and muttering something about spirits and wind, when all he really needed was an orange. Historians still argue whether pirates were actively smart about nutrition or just lucky, but the outcome was clear. Pirate crews that raided island ports and ate like locals survived longer. Some even started storing dried citrus peels in their chests as medicine, not because they had a science degree, but because the guy who chewed orange peel didn't die, and that was good enough for them. Compare this to medieval kings, who sometimes died of malnutrition surrounded by food because their personal doctors believed vegetables were untrustworthy. One actual 14th century remedy for scurvy was sit in a hot bath while holding a rooster. Pirates preferred limes. Reasonable. Let's not pretend it was perfect, though. When food stores ran low, or when the ship got stranded, scurvy made a comeback. Entire crews would rot from the inside out. Teeth fell out mid-conversation. Old scars opened up. Muscles turned to jelly. And still, pirates had better odds than royal soldiers because they adapted faster. They learned from local populations. They shared remedies orally, through stories, not textbooks. If someone in Port Royal told them mango leaves cured nausea, they tried it. If it worked, it spread. In fact, some pirate ships had a designated herb guy, a crew member responsible for foraging and recognizing edible or medicinal plants when ashore. That's right, pirates, often painted as brainless brutes, had in-house botanists. Meanwhile, kings had astrologers who prescribed leeches based on Jupiter's mood. And here's the most ironic twist of all. The British Royal Navy didn't officially adopt lemon juice as a scurvy preventative until 1795, centuries after pirates were already chewing limes like sea candy. That's right, the guys with hooks for hands and parrots on their shoulders were outpacing the most powerful empire on Earth in basic health science. Of course, the pirates didn't do this for science. They did it for survival, for loot, for the right to chew food without crying. Scurvy didn't care how fearsome you looked. It didn't care if you'd just taken a Spanish galleon. If you didn't get vitamin C, you became a living biology experiment and not the fun kind. So next time you see a pirate with a gold earring and a glass of grog, know this. He might be holding that orange slice like his treasure. And honestly, it kind of was. Because while kings were bathing in rosewater and bleeding themselves with antique syringes, pirates were over here accidentally inventing survival-based nutrition. No PHDS, no royal decree, just a toothless guy shouting, "Eat the lemon or die, mate." Alright, scurvy's been scurvy, your teeth are intact, and you survived 3 impromptu surgeries. So now let's talk about where you're convalescing. A pirate ship sick bay. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a bay, or even a room. It was usually a dark, stinking corner near the bottom of the ship, where injured crewmates hung in hammocks, prayed to multiple gods, and hoped no one spilled gunpowder nearby. Still, for all its disgusting realities, the pirate infirmary, if you can call it that, was a functioning communal care system that, again, put many royal setups to shame. Let's set the scene. You're down below deck, in a tight space that smells like sweat, mildew, blood, and rum-soaked rope. There are hammocks strung up like a spiderweb. The floor creaks. Someone's moaning in the corner. Someone else is sharpening a knife next to a chicken. Welcome to the floating hospital. Every pirate ship was different, but most had a designated area for the wounded, even if it was just a corner with better airflow and fewer rats. Some larger ships repurposed crew quarters for healing after battle. Others cleared out storage space, tossing cannonballs aside to make room for a crewmate missing his spleen. And the care? Surprisingly organized. There was no nurse per se, but wounded pirates were rarely left to rot. Crewmates took turns bringing food, changing bandages, and yelling at the unconscious guy to breathe louder. They weren't trained caregivers, but they were fiercely loyal, and they understood that ignoring the injured today meant being ignored tomorrow. Compare that to medieval battlefield medicine. A soldier bleeding out on the plains of France might lie for days before anyone dragged him to safety. There were no protocols, no rites, no rum. Pirates had all 3. Even better, the hammock system. Pirates didn't sleep on rigid bunks. They used hanging hammocks, which had the accidental medical benefit of cradling the body, reducing pressure sores, and rocking the injured to sleep. That's right. Pirates unintentionally invented ergonomic hospital beds centuries before Victorian medicine realized wooden slabs were bad for broken ribs. Fringe tidbit? Some pirate surgeons preferred treating patients in hammocks during surgery. The gentle sway helped keep them still, and blood dripped through the fabric. Gross? Absolutely. But also kind of brilliant. And then there were the makeshift privacy dividers, usually sheets or sailcloth hung between hammocks to give injured crewmates a bit of dignity. It wasn't much, but it beat getting stitched up in full view of the guy cooking fish 3 feet away. Still, it wasn't a spa. Infection spread fast. There were no antiseptics beyond rum, salt, and boiling water. Bugs were everywhere. The air was damp, and the only soundtrack was groaning and the occasional scream. But somehow, the system worked often enough to keep pirates functioning. Even mental health was considered sort of a pirate suffering from trauma, grief, or madness, and there was a lot of all 3. Wouldn't be institutionalized or bled dry by a medieval doctor with leeches. He'd be assigned lighter duties, given more rest, and often left alone to recover. And the crew? They understood. They might not have called it PTSD, but they knew the signs. Night terrors, outbursts, talking to invisible parrots. Instead of ridicule, there was often space. And in some cases, promotion to less stressful jobs like quartermaster or lookout. Historians still argue how widespread this informal mental health system was, but diaries and logs hint at a surprising level of compassion. One account from a captured pirate mentioned a crewmate who had gone moon mad after the storm and was excused from battle duties indefinitely. Now let's talk logistics. Pirate ships usually had a shared supply of medical rations, bandages, often old shirts, salves, herb mixes, or animal fat, and a barrel of something flammable to sterilize tools. When they ran low, the crew would restock during raids, not just grabbing gold, but stealing medicine, herbs, and dried fruits from merchant ships. In one famous case, a pirate raid on a French cargo vessel netted no treasure, but 2 crates of surgical gear and dried lemons. The pirates let the ship go and kept the vitamins. Royal navies, on the other hand, often ignored or undervalued medical stock. Soldiers were expected to tough it out. Surgeons begged for supplies. And many kings refused to fund more than the bare minimum because they assumed soldiers were disposable. Pirates? Every crew member was an investment. If you let him die, that was a loss to the whole ship. So what did recovery look like? You'd lie in your hammock for days, weeks even. Crewmates would bring you food, soft stuff like mashed beans, stew, or stolen fruit. They'd clean your wounds with seawater or rum. Someone might tell you jokes. Others would share stories to keep your mind off the pain. And when you got better, you got your post back. No shame, no discharge, just a nod and a return to duty, sometimes even with new respect, because surviving a pirate sick bay meant you were tougher than a hurricane and meaner than the ship's cat. Medieval kings had doctors in gilded robes. Pirates had knife-wielding cooks with empathy and hammocks that rocked you to sleep. And you know what? I'd take the hammock. Let's say you made it through surgery, survived a rum-drenched recovery, and you're finally back on your feet or foot, depending on how well the saw went. You limp up to the main deck, squint into the sun, and suddenly realize the guy who stabbed you last week is now your caretaker. Welcome to the wildest clause in pirate medicine, the sick bay mutiny loophole. You see, pirate society, unlike monarchies and navies, was built on code and consensus. That didn't stop them from being chaotic, violent-y goblins, but it did mean their ships operated with something resembling a weird, rum-scented democracy. And part of that system, even the injured had rights. Seriously, pirate codes, those legendary articles agreed upon before setting sail, often had built-in protections not just for loot shares and behavior, but for the wounded. If you were stuck in your hammock full of stitches and regrets, you could still vote on everything, including whether the guy who botched your surgery should walk the plank. That kind of agency was unheard of on land. Medieval soldiers had no say in anything. Wounded knights were sometimes dumped in monasteries like defective merchandise. But on a pirate ship, you could be half dead and still cast a vote on leadership battle plans, or whether to keelhaul Jim for stealing grog. Historians still argue whether this level of enfranchisement was universal, or just common on the more democratic ships like those led by Bartholomew Roberts or Samuel Bellamy. But the records we have show this wasn't symbolic. It was real influence. Fringe example, on one Caribbean ship in the 1720s, a wounded gunner, who'd lost 2 fingers and most of his patience, convinced the crew to overthrow the quartermaster who denied him extra rum during recovery. A man with 9 fingers and 0 chill changed the chain of command. From a hammock, let's be real, that's not healthcare. That's hammock Congress. And the logic behind it makes sense. Pirate crews understood that recovery wasn't just about bandages and booze. It was about dignity. If you stripped someone of their voice just because they were hurt, morale crumbled. And unlike kings, pirates couldn't afford morale crisis. Their entire system worked because everyone felt seen, even a guy drooling through a fever dream. In some cases, recovering pirates were given temporary immunity from punishment. This wasn't kindness, it was risk management. You didn't want to accidentally kill someone mid-healing, because they called the cook's soup inedible sea vomit. The code demanded patience. In fact, there are written cases where pirates voted to delay mutinies or disciplinary actions until the injured parties could physically attend the shouting match. Medieval kings? They'd exile you while you were still on morphine. Pirates waited until you were loose enough to throw hands. Now here's where it gets even juicier. Pirates could also invoke their wounded status as leverage. If someone felt they were unfairly treated, denied food, mocked for their scars, or passed over for a share of loot, they could call for a ship-wide vote, even in bandages, even mid-fever. This wasn't just performative democracy. The votes could stick. Whole leadership structures were sometimes reshuffled based on sickbay politics. And yeah, that led to drama. One surgeon's apprentice in 1716 was allegedly thrown overboard because 3 of his patients healed worse than they entered, and they collectively decided he smelled cursed. Was that medical malpractice? Voodoo paranoia? Peer-reviewed revenge? Who knows? But the patients had power. And let's be clear, they used it. Even more radical? Some pirate codes guaranteed care until full recovery, with zero forced labor. Compare that to land-based systems where injured soldiers were often pushed back into work before their wounds closed. Pirates gave you time, not always out of compassion, but out of self-preservation. A half-healed crewmate was a liability. Kings, by contrast, often saw wounded soldiers as broken tools, dismissed, forgotten, sometimes used as battlefield examples of why armor matters. Pirates? They toasted you. They called you a survivor. They probably nicknamed you Lefty and told the new recruits you once scared off a shark using your stump. Let's not oversell it. Pirates were still violent, mercurial, and often completely unhinged. But the fact remains, they didn't let injury erase your humanity. Even when bedridden, you could still call someone a traitor, make a motion to throw them overboard, or suggest renaming the ship to the Floating Regret. This egalitarian streak, born of survival, not philosophy, made pirate ships some of the earliest examples of injury-inclusive leadership. And yes, that's a phrase I just made up. But it fits, because on a pirate ship, even if your leg was gone, your voice wasn't. And sometimes that voice was the loudest on deck. Alright, you survived the sword fights, the rum surgeries, and the hammock politics. You're finally on the mend, maybe even back to duty, or at least yelling encouraging things from the crow's nest. But then something strange happens. Another ship appears. Royal Navy, maybe big, slow, fancy. Its deck gleams with polish and pride. And then it hits you, they're way sicker than you are. It's time we talk about the epic medical mismatch between pirate crews and Royal Navies, and how pirate medkits, improvised, grungy, and often made from goat parts, somehow outperform the well-funded healthcare systems of kings. Let's start with the obvious. Money did not equal medicine. Kings threw gold at surgeons, apothecaries, and astrologers who promised healing through a delightful blend of prayer, horoscopes, and burning various herbs near your toes. Pirate ships had no such luxury, which weirdly made them better at solving actual problems. Royal Naval surgeons were officially trained. Yes, but they were often bogged down by outdated medical doctrine, bureaucratic red tape, and egos bigger than their powdered wigs. Pirate surgeons, they learn by experience, panic, and occasionally vivisection. Let's compare med kits. Royal Navy surgeons chest asterisk surgical knives, fine polished steel, asterisk mercury-based ointments. Yes, mercury. Asterisk leeches. You knew they were coming. Asterisk binding herbs. Asterisk prayer book. Asterisk zero humor. Pirate med chest asterisk. Asterisk rusty saw. Occasionally cleaned with fire. Asterisk rum. Internal plus external use. Asterisk saltwater soaked bandages. Asterisk random herbal brews from wherever they landed last. Asterisk possibly a parrot. Asterisk zero shame. Guess which one washed their tools more often? Hint, it wasn't the guy with a monogrammed waistcoat. Historians still argue how often pirate surgeons cleaned instruments, but anecdotal logs suggest that Shockingly, some did it between procedures. Not out of germ theory. They didn't have that. But because bloody tools made people nervous, and nervous pirates were bad for business. Meanwhile, many royal surgeons went from one patient to the next with zero sanitization. Because the real enemy, they believed, was an imbalance of humors, not, literal bacteria swimming in open wounds. Fringe tidbit? Pirate surgeons would sometimes light their blades on fire before using them. Not for effect, although that helped, but because fire sterilized steel better than spitting on it. It also scared off unhelpful assistants. Multifunctional. Now, let's talk nutrition. On long voyages, naval ships often fed their crews salt pork, hardtack, and despair. Water went rancid quickly. Fruit was rare. Scurvy was inevitable. Meanwhile, pirates, being practical raiders, stole fresh produce whenever they could, not out of enlightenment, but because vomiting citrus peels was preferable to vomiting your pancreas. Royal ships? Bureaucracy often delayed rations, leading to entire crews wasting away while the captain wrote letters about whose fault it was. Pirates? If they didn't like the food, they raided a fishing village. The result? Pirate crews, while filthy, violent, and permanently buzzed, were often better fed, less vitamin deficient, and more physically agile than their royal counterparts. Which is probably why so many Navy men defected to pirate life after a single battle. Imagine being a sailor under King George, suffering from open sores and bleeding gums, and then getting captured by pirates who say, "Here, have a mango and a job of health care." Hard to say no. And let's not forget how hierarchy messed up royal medicine. Officers got treated first. Common sailors were patched up if there was time. Pirates? Everyone got equal treatment, because everyone shared the same risk. And the same barrel of lemon water stew. There's a fantastic irony here. The so-called criminals, the scourge of the sea, ran ships with the injured at voting rights, the wounded at pensions, and everyone got rum. Meanwhile, royal navies with their medals and flags often left men to die while debating which planet's alignment caused infection. Also worth noting, rehabilitation. On royal ships, once injured, you were considered damaged goods. Your rations got cut. You lost rank. On pirate ships, injuries earned you respect. A missing limb was a promotion in coolness, and might land you a cushy post swabbing decks or intimidating new recruits with your horrifying eye socket. And yes, pirates adapted. If a crew member couldn't swing a cutlass anymore, maybe he could load cannons, or steer, or, at the very least, act as a terrifying figurehead strapped to the bow during boarding. Everyone had a place. Royal Navies? You got discharged, or ignored, or declared mad and locked in a room with a priest. To sum it up, pirate healthcare was crude, bloody, and fueled by alcohol, but was also fast, community-driven, and weirdly effective. Royal medical systems, for all their pomp, were often slower, more hierarchical, and more concerned with theater than healing. So the next time someone tells you that pirates were just drunken savages, ask them which system gave you a vote, a lemon, a prosthetic, and a hammock to cry in. Because when it came to healthcare, pirates weren't the disease. They were the accidental cure. By now, you're patched up, full of citrus, and you successfully shouted down a quartermaster from your hammock. Life's good, relatively speaking. But then you look around the deck and notice something strange. There's a guy with a wooden peg where his leg should be, another with a metal hook for a hand, and someone else using an eye patch like a designer accessory. Are you aboard a warship or the prototype cast for Pirates of the Caribbean? Orthopedic edition? It's time to dive into one of pirate medicine's most fascinating chapters: amputations, peg legs, and fashionable functional prosthetics. Let's not sugarcoat it. Amputations were common. Gunfire, sword fights, falling rigging, and exploding barrels meant that losing a limb was basically an occupational hazard. If you pirated long enough, Odds were high that some part of you would end up shark food. But here's what made pirates different. They prepared for it. Not just mentally, logistically. The process was, of course, horrifying. No anesthesia. No sterile operating room. Just rum, rope to bite, and the hope that the surgeon wasn't too hungover. But once the deed was done, pirates didn't just stop at cut it off and cauterize. They took it one step further. Replace it. Let's start with peg legs. These weren't decorative. They were mobility devices. Carved by ship carpenters, peg legs were custom fitted to the user's height, weight, and sometimes even their walk style. Some had leather straps. Others had crude hinges. A few, this is real, had spike bottoms for traction during boarding parties. That's right. Pirates weaponized their legs. And guess what? They could walk. Limp, yes, but they moved. Peg-legged pirates loaded cannons, carried swords, climbed rigging. In fact, being a peg often earned you extra respect. A visible sign of surviving a brutal life and still coming back for more. Then there's the classic hook hand. Much rarer than pop culture suggests, but not entirely fictional. Some pirates did attach curved or pointed iron implements to their wrist stumps. These weren't always full hooks. Sometimes they were repurposed tools like knife hilts, rigging picks, or even carved wooden clamps. And while some kings and nobles wore gloves to hide disfigurements, pirates leaned into it. You had a hook, you showed the hook. You used it to gesture menacingly, or to pop corks, or both. Fringe fact? One Caribbean pirate was known for using his metal wrist blade to carve up fruit during negotiations. Allegedly, this made him both terrifying and surprisingly charming. Historians still argue how advanced these prosthetics really were. Some may have been symbolic or rarely used. But we do know that pirate crews made serious efforts to keep wounded members functional. Losing a limb didn't mean retirement. It meant adaptation. And not just for show, for survival. Remember, pirates didn't have replacements waiting on land. Every crew member mattered. So they invented function. They took bits of rope, leather, metal, and wood and crafted tools that allowed their friends to keep fighting, working, and looting. Now let's talk eye patches, another pirate stereotype that's kind of true. Not everyone wore one, and not always due to injury. But when pirates did lose an eye, and eye injuries were tragically common, a patch reduced infection, protected the socket, and helped them adjust between light levels, especially below deck. In fact, some sailors wore patches intentionally over one good eye to preserve their night vision when moving from sunlight to the ship's hold. That's not myth. That's adaptive seafaring strategy. Compare all this to medieval and royal systems. Lose a limb in a king's army? You were lucky if they let you beg outside the castle gates. Prosthetics? Maybe a wooden stump. Maybe nothing. Your usefulness was gone. So was your value. Pirates? They gave you a nickname, a job, and probably a drink. And they did it without medical degrees, without funding, and without the benefit of germ theory. They did it because they had to, and because they understood, intuitively, savagely, that a pirate who survives an injury is a pirate worth keeping. These makeshift prosthetics weren't just practical. They became part of pirate culture. You weren't disabled. You were seasoned. Every missing limb was a story. Every scar a promotion. Every replacement part a badge of honor, which made pirate ships some of the earliest environments to practice functional inclusion. Not out of kindness, out of pragmatism. You lost a leg? That's fine. We'll carve you a new one. You lost a hand? Cool. Now you're Hook Mike. You lost an eye? Great. You're the new lookout. Still breathing? You're still one of us. It's a brutal kind of loyalty, but it's loyalty nonetheless. So next time someone jokes about pirates being dirty cutthroats with missing limbs, you can nod and say, yes. And they turned it into a system. a grotesque rum-fueled patchwork system that somehow worked. Okay, so you got a peg leg, a hook hand, and an eye patch that probably doubles as a sleep mask. You're practically a walking pirate starter pack. But guess what? You're still not safe. Not even close. Because the real danger now, everything you can't see, the microscopic horrors, plagues, parasites, and the charming mystery of why everyone's skin is suddenly falling off. Time to talk about one of the least glamorous and most impressive parts of pirate healthcare, their response to disease outbreaks, or in their words, keeping the rot from spreading. Let's start with what was floating in the average pirate bloodstream. Asterisk scurvy, already covered, still horrifying. Asterisk dysentery. Asterisk typhus. Asterisk malaria. Asterisk ringworm. Asterisk lice. Asterisk fungal infections. Asterisk worms. So many worms. Basically, if it squirmed, oozed, or itched, a pirate probably had it. And yet, somehow, they managed to limit catastrophic outbreaks. Not eliminate, mind you, but pirates had their own low-budget version of the CDC. Their main strategy? Shipboard quarantine. When someone started looking a little plaguey, sweaty, shivering, raving about fish in Latin, they were often isolated immediately, not out of compassion, but because everyone knew what happened when a fever spread on a floating wooden death trap. Everyone died. So the sick crewmate was moved to asterisk the corner of the hold, asterisk a separate hammock strung under the gun deck, asterisk, or, if things got really sketchy, an abandoned lifeboat tied to the ship. That's right, the original floating quarantine bubble. Just you, your cough, and the waves. Now, were these pirate quarantines effective? Sometimes. They at least slowed the spread, which gave the rest of the crew time to stock up on lemons, check their groins for boils, and start praying to every deity from Neptune to whoever oversaw rashes. Meanwhile, back in the royal courts, medieval kings had entire palaces wiped out because someone sneezed near a banister. The Black Death didn't spare titles. Fancy robes did not prevent internal bleeding. And when outbreaks hit, the elite response was often, asterisk pray harder, asterisk burn something, asterisk blame a witch, asterisk bleed the patient until they fainted or forgot they were sick. Pirates? Way more pragmatic. They threw the infected in a separate zone, cleaned everything they touched with rum or boiling water, and stopped sharing cups for like a day. Progress. Fringe fact? Some pirate ships carried vinegar or seawater in barrels specifically for cleansing the hold. Was this effective sanitation? Kind of. Vinegar kills some bacteria. Seawater helps disinfect wounds, sort of. And it smelled slightly less awful than open infection. Historians still argue whether these health practices were based on sailor tradition, cultural borrowing, some of it from African and indigenous knowledge, or just common sense born of not wanting to die horribly. Probably all three. And while they weren't reading medical journals, pirates didn't know the signs of impending doom. Asterisk, a weird cough spreading through the crew. Asterisk black spots or boils. Asterisk softening of the gums. Yes, that was a thing. Asterisk the smell of rot coming from someone still breathing. Any of these would trigger emergency measures, often enforced by the quartermaster, who, despite sounding like an accountant, was basically the ship's enforcer/health inspector. And then there were the parasites. Oh, the parasites. Shiprats carried fleas. Fleas carried disease. Lice were everywhere. Worms were a given. Pirates lived in close quarters, wore the same clothes for weeks, and shared food like it was a group therapy exercise. So when one person got infested, yeah, everyone got itchy. Solutions included asterisk shaving heads, asterisk burning bedding, asterisk eating charcoal, asterisk drinking rum until the bugs either died or fled in disgust. It wasn't elegant, but again, It worked better than what most kings offered. In one documented case, a pirate crew near the West African coast burned their own sails to smoke out lice and bedbugs. Did they also give themselves respiratory problems? Definitely. But you know what they didn't get? Typhus. So when? Compare that to a medieval castle where the cure for lice was wrap your hair in bacon fat and sing a hymn. No shade to bacon. But that wasn't going to stop the plague. And yet, even amid all this chaos, pirates managed basic disease containment. They rotated hammocks. They used the sea as a washing machine. They boiled water when they could. They accepted loss but didn't invite it. Did they still die of disease? Of course, in horrifying ways. But they didn't pretend it wasn't happening. They didn't make up magical theories about angry moons. They just adapted, adjusted, and occasionally threw their sickest crewmates off the ship with a sad toast. And that's more than many kings could say. So next time you hear plague ship, don't just imagine rotting corpses and gory ghost stories. Picture a crew of hardened survivors doing their best to outwit the invisible enemy, with nothing but vinegar, superstition, and grim determination. You've made it through surgery, citrus therapy, and a minor bout of worms. Physically, holding up. Mentally, well, let's talk about that. Because if there's one aspect of pirate healthcare that rarely gets attention, it's the part that's not visible on your skin. Tonight, we're diving into the uncharted waters of mental health on the high seas. And yes, pirates absolutely had issues. To be fair, everyone did back then. Life in the 17th and 18th centuries was just one long series of trauma sandwiches served cold. But pirates, by definition, lived louder, risked harder, and died messier, which meant their brains took a serious beating, even if no one called it PTSD. So what happened when a pirate cracked? Unlike royal courts, where mental illness was either punished, exorcised, or locked in a tower, pirate crews had a different approach. They rolled with it. If someone started talking to invisible sea gods or reliving battles mid-shanty, the response wasn't usually banish him. It was more like, give him less rum and maybe don't put him on cannon duty. In other words, adjust, not exile. Historians still argue whether pirates recognized trauma as trauma, or simply treated unstable crewmates as eccentric cousins who needed space. But evidence suggests that pirates were remarkably tolerant of mental breakdowns, probably because, let's be honest, everyone was at least a little unhinged already, and they had their coping mechanisms. Asterisk music and storytelling. See, shanties weren't just bangers. They were collective therapy, processing fear, grief, and frustration in catchy 4/4 time. Asterisk nicknames. Many pirates were named after traumatic events. Mad Tom, Silent Will, Shivers. These weren't insults. They were acknowledgments. Asterisk, we see your damage. We're still here. Asterisk rotation of duties. Someone clearly losing it? Pull them off combat. Let them cook. Let them mend sails. Let them be. Compare this to medieval armies, where breakdowns were seen as weakness, treason, or proof that Satan had moved into your frontal lobe. Kings often executed soldiers for deserting mid-battle, even if that desertion was clearly someone having a panic attack in full armor. Pirates? They were too busy surviving to judge. Fringe fact? Some ships made space in the hold for what they called the low berth, essentially a hammock in a dark, quiet area. Not for injuries. For meltdowns, it wasn't official. But it was known. You had a breakdown, you went to the low berth. Someone would bring you bread. Someone else would tell you a story. Then, eventually you'd crawl back out. Did it solve anything? No. But it was space. It was the sea's version of mental health leave, without the HR paperwork. And let's not forget, pirates had every reason to be mentally fried. Asterisk constant mortal danger. Asterisk betrayals. Asterisk isolation. Asterisk horrific injuries. Asterisk lack of sleep. Asterisk substance abuse. Asterisk witnessing the worst of humanity. While being it, even the toughest pirate could unravel after a particularly bad storm, a failed raid, or the death of a close crewmate. And instead of pretending to be fine, pirates had the rare freedom to break openly, yell at the ocean, curse God, cry into their hammock. And nobody thought less of you, because everyone knew they were one cannon misfire away from the same fate. That's not to say pirates were saints. Some mocked the unwell. Some got violent. Some locked people in barrels until they calmed down. Not great psychiatry, to be honest. But overall, they had more built-in emotional allowances than many civilized systems. And they had one big advantage. Community. Pirates didn't live alone. They worked, ate, fought, sang, and bled together, which meant they saw each other. If you started unraveling, someone noticed. Maybe it was the cook, maybe the gunner, maybe that guy with a tattoo of a mermaid holding a chicken. Someone always noticed. Contrast that with kings, who often didn't even recognize their own soldiers unless they were bleeding loudly in the throne room. Royal physicians diagnosed melancholy with vague gestures and vague herbs. Pirates diagnosed it by watching you stare at the wall for 3 days straight and then saying, "All right, you're swabbing today? No knives." It wasn't therapy, but it wasn't nothing. Some pirate ships even had what can only be described as spiritual protocols, borrowed from African, indigenous, and Caribbean traditions, rituals for grief, ceremonies for the dead, songs to honor the lost. These weren't just traditions, they were processing tools. Even the notorious burial at sea had psychological weight. It was a ceremony, a release, a shared recognition of mortality, and a reminder that everyone still breathing mattered. It's worth mentioning that substance abuse, especially rum, was both a coping mechanism and a massive problem. Pirates drank a lot. Some drank to dull pain. Others drank to shut up the screaming inside. And while this led to accidents, fights, and a few dramatic sword duels over a spilled cup, it also functioned as group sedation. If everyone's drinking, no one's alone. Was it healthy? Not even close. But was it emotionally democratic? Strangely, yes. Mental health wasn't a category for pirates. It was a shared condition. Everyone was messed up. Everyone had nightmares. Everyone had scars they didn't talk about. And somehow, they built a culture that didn't demand masking. You could be damaged and still belong. So when the rum ran out, the storms hit, and the ghosts of fallen crewmates whispered through the ropes, pirates did what they always did. They sang louder. They held on tighter. And they didn't let go of each other. Asterisk, asterisk. Now that we explored the psychological swamp that was pirate life, let's take one final turn into the truly weird and wonderfully unscientific corner of pirate medicine. The kind that smells like burnt sage, chicken bones, and poor decisions. Yes, it's time for herbs, charms, and sea witch healers, aka how pirates treated illness when rum and knives weren't enough. You might be thinking, wait, didn't pirates just drink through everything? Yes, but also no, because when things got truly desperate, when the fever wouldn't break, when the wound wouldn't close, when the screams wouldn't stop, pirates reached for something older than rum. Magic. Let's get this out of the way. Most pirates were wildly superstitious. They believed in sea curses, ghost ships, unlucky tattoos, haunted parrots, and, yes, folk medicine. And when your best surgeon was a former stable boy with a meat cleaver, sometimes a charm bag, and a chant started to sound pretty reasonable. Historians still argue about how deeply these beliefs were held versus how performative they were. But the evidence suggests pirate crews regularly leaned into spiritual healing, not as a replacement for physical treatment, but as an emotional and cultural insurance policy. Let's start with the herbs. Many pirates, especially those who had sailed to the Caribbean, West Africa, or the Americas, picked up medicinal plant knowledge from local populations. And that stuff worked. Examples include asterisk aloe vera, used for burns and rashes. Asterisk calamus root, chewed for toothaches. Asterisk garlic and honey paste, antibacterial treatment. Asterisk papaya leaves, parasite control. Asterisk chewed bark, fever reducer. These weren't guesses. These were real treatments, often passed between cultures. Pirates didn't care about scientific journals. They cared about what stopped the pus. Many crews kept bundles of dried herbs in canvas pouches, hung near the sick bay or tied to masts. These weren't labeled, and the dosages were chaotic, but they represented something deeper. The ship's attempt at healing without cutting. Then there were the charms, a mix of spiritual tools and panic-induced creativity. Think, asterisk animal bones carved with protective symbols. Asterisk bottles of grave dirt or black salt. Asterisk coins pierced and worn as amulets. Asterisk sailcloth dolls stuffed with herbs. Asterisk rings passed down from a guy who never got sick, ever, swear on my soul. One fringe record mentions a pirate who wore a necklace made of dried lizard tails, claiming it kept the blood demons away. Was it fashionable? No. Did it stop him from getting malaria? Also no, but it made him feel powerful, and in an era with no vaccines, confidence counted for something. And then, the most fascinating role of all, the sea witch healer. Every now and then, a pirate crew would include someone, usually older, usually semi-retired from stabbing people, who acted as a spiritual advisor and folk medic. They weren't witches in classic sense, but they blended herbalism, superstition, and brute experience into something resembling coastal shamanism. This person might asterisk prepare poultices for infected wounds, asterisk cast protective circles before battle, asterisk lead prayers or chants during surgeries, asterisk burn herbs to cleanse the blood, asterisk scare rats out whole with rhythmic drumming. Unclear if this worked. They were treated with a mix of reverence and fear. You wanted them on your side, especially if you were bleeding out and didn't trust the carpenter with the bone saw. In a strange way, these healers were the pirate version of hospital chaplains, offering peace, placebo, and occasionally actual results. Now contrast this with royal courts. In medieval Europe, medical superstition was tightly bound to religion. Healing required church approval. Magic was either miracle or heresy. So if someone cured your plague rash with a leaf and a chant, depending on who was watching, they either became a saint or got set on fire. Pirates didn't have that problem. They had no church oversight, no inquisition, no one to say, hey, maybe don't rub ground oyster shell on that boil. So they experimented. They mixed science, myth, and desperation into something that, more often than not, kept at least some of them alive. And if it didn't work, they held a funeral, blamed the moon, and doubled the herbs next time. Importantly, this fusion of practical and magical medicine wasn't just desperation. It was cultural inheritance. Pirate crews were often racially and ethnically mixed: Caribbean, West African, Irish, English, Indigenous, Spanish. That meant a mashup of belief systems, all tossed into a cauldron of collective survival. You might have asterisk a West African root, doctor brewing teas, asterisk an Irish sailor, carrying iron for protection, asterisk a Spanish pirate muttering saints' names while setting bones, asterisk a former slave leading healing chants under a blood moon. It was messy, but it was shared. And in that shared ritual, pirates built a form of healthcare that wasn't just medical. It was emotional, spiritual, and social. So the next time someone scoffs at the idea of a pirate, sea witch waving sage over a festering wound, remind them, kings had bloodletting and astrology. Pirates had healing circles and lizard bones. Asterisk, asterisk. And honestly, only one of those included group singing and citrus. You survived combat, scurvy, spiritual poultices, and a ship-wide lice bath. Things are looking up. You're limping, twitching, slightly cursed, and one toe away from retirement. But there's one last chapter of pirate medicine that pushes the line between practical and morbidly curious. Autopsy, post-mortem, forensic piracy, asterisk, asterisk, or as they called it, figuring out what went wrong before it kills the rest of us. Yes, pirates occasionally practice their own brand of after-death science, usually with no gloves, no shame, and absolutely no formal training. It wasn't always dignified, but it was driven by necessity. Because when half your crew starts dropping and you don't know why, there's only one way to find out. Open someone up and look inside. Let's be clear. Pirates weren't conducting elegant dissections with Latin labels and crisp white aprons. This wasn't the Renaissance anatomy theater. This was slice him open before he bloats, performed with a boarding knife and a whole lot of guesswork. The goals of these crude autopsies: asterisk spot obvious signs of disease, boils, blackened organs, parasites. Asterisk check for poison, especially if someone died suspiciously mid-argument. Asterisk remove cursed body parts. Yes, really? Asterisk, and most importantly, warn the living, because pirates, for all their flaws, were highly motivated not to die in the same way their bunkmate just did. Historians still argue whether these early post-mortem attempts influenced broader medical understanding, or if they were just high-stakes curiosity. But we have logs and ship journals, written by captured pirates, naval spies, or terrified scribes, that mention gutting the dead man for clues. Sometimes these even helped pirates adjust how they stored food or treated future wounds. Fringe fact: one pirate ship recorded removing a blackened liver from a sailor who died after drinking from a contaminated rum barrel. The crew dumped the rest of the barrel at sea and established a temporary rum check rule that lasted about 2 weeks. Still, preventative action. Royal doctors were squeamish about opening up corpses. Church laws in many kingdoms banned human dissection outright, unless done under religious supervision, which usually meant someone said a prayer and then immediately blamed demons. Pirates had no such restraint. Their operating motto was, if he's dead anyway, let's at least learn something. Practical, if a bit horrifying. And let's not forget the other reason pirates cracked open corpses. They thought some body parts were cursed. If a sailor died screaming or during a red moon, or with strange symbols drawn on their skin, often tattoos misunderstood by the crew, the assumption was something unnatural happened, and the cure was to find and remove the tainted part. Did this involve ritual? Absolutely. Sometimes they'd toss the body part overboard. Sometimes they'd burn it in a circle of knives. One journal entry described a crew burying a sailor's heart on shore with a dead parrot and a lock of red hair to break the storm. Was this medicine? Not really. Was it mental health therapy in disguise? Kind of. And while these posthumous practices may seem ridiculous, they served a crucial purpose: closure. Pirates didn't have therapists, or priests, or family waiting back home. When someone died, they didn't vanish into hospital paperwork. They were mourned by the only people who mattered: the crew, who needed a reason, even if they had a car went out of the chest cavity. And if it kept morale intact, if it gave the crew a sense of understanding or safety, then it worked. Compare that to royal courts, where nobles died in plush beds and no one ever asked questions. Doctors blamed vapors or melancholia and immediately focused on which cousin got the estate. There was no investigation, no reflection, just perfume, prayer, and pretense. Pirates couldn't afford pretense. They needed answers, if only to know which cask not to drink from next. Sometimes these investigations did lead to better practices: more frequent cleaning of cuts, more separation between sick and healthy hammocks. Even changes in diet, like avoiding raw fish after a sailor keeled over mid-chew. In one particularly gruesome case, A crew discovered a nest of intestinal worms inside a dead shipmate. They didn't know what to call them, but the next port they hit, they bought out every herb market supply of bitter roots and garlic. No proof it worked, but at least they tried. And trying at sea was everything, because pirates lived in a world where everybody died young. If you made it to 40 with all your teeth and limbs, you were basically a legend. So every death was a chance, not just to mourn, but to avoid the same fate. They couldn't stop death, but they could poke it, prod it, curse it, and maybe learn from it. So next time someone tells you pirates were just bloodthirsty looters with zero sophistication, remember, they dissected the dead. They burned curse livers. They tried to understand their world, even when it was bleeding all over the deck. And that, strangely enough, is the root of all medicine. So here we are, stitched, splinted, semi-possessed, and still standing. You survived cannon fire, amputations, dental horror, plague rats, haunted elbows, and the occasional floating quarantine raft. And somehow, through sheer desperation, salty wisdom, and 0 degrees from the University of Cambridge, pirate crews kept each other alive. But what legacy did they leave behind? Let's close the loop with something unexpected. Modern medicine owes more to pirates than you think. Now, no, pirates didn't invent hospitals or invent vaccines. They didn't write anatomy textbooks or develop sterile operating rooms. But they did something more fundamental, something that the medical establishment took centuries to figure out. Backhand Dindex pointing right, they put people first. While kings and emperors treated their soldiers like disposable chess pieces, pirates said, "If you bleed for us, we take care of you." They created early versions of asterisk universal health coverage, with coins instead of copays. Asterisk disability insurance. Lose a leg? Here's your silver. Asterisk mental health leave. You seem broken. Go swab the deck and scream into the ocean. Asterisk adaptive prosthetics. Hello, hook hands and peg legs. Asterisk quarantine zones. Asterisk sanitation rituals. Asterisk nutritional prioritization. Looking at you, citrus. Asterisk crew-wide democracy, including the bedridden. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't precise. But it was pragmatic. And sometimes, pragmatism saves more lives than prestige. Royal medical systems eventually adopted bits of this pirate logic, often without realizing it. Naval codes began to include injury compensation. Ship designs began to include actual sick bays. And, yes, doctors finally came around to the idea that maybe lemons are more useful than bloodletting. Historians still argue how directly this pirate pragmatism influenced modern systems. Was it imitation? Convergent evolution, or just a loud, rum-soaked example of what happens when medicine becomes a team sport? What's undeniable is this. Pirate ships, for all their lawlessness and violence, were places where people looked out for each other, not out of morality, but out of sheer, gritty necessity. They couldn't afford to ignore crewmates' pain. That pain affected the ship, the mission, the loot, and so they healed each other, badly, drunkenly, but earnestly. Fringe fact? The Royal Navy eventually adopted mandatory citrus rations in 1795, nearly 80 years after pirates had already figured out. That change alone likely saved tens of thousands of lives. Somewhere on a storm-tossed deck, a pirate with no toes and half a liver probably raised a lime to the sky and whispered, "Took you long enough." What pirates left behind wasn't a formal medical tradition. It was a spirit of adaptation, of shared risk, of seeing broken people not as burdens, but as battle-hardened assets. We tend to romanticize pirates, or cartoonify them, as eye-patch buffoons who only care about gold and grog. But their approach to health shows something more complicated, more human. They were rough, unrefined, sometimes horrifying, but they were also early adopters of a crucial truth. Healing isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, asterisk, asterisk. Even if your only tools are rum, fire, and a stubborn refusal to let a friend die alone. And so, as the sea stretches dark and endless around their memory, we salute them, not just as rogues and rebels, but as accidental pioneers in the messy, imperfect, miraculous practice of staying alive. The wind quiets now. The waves have softened. Above the ship, the stars blink like old scars, glowing reminders that every survivor leaves a light behind. Below deck, the hammocks sway gently, creaking in rhythm, lulling weary bodies into half-sleep. The saws are cleaned. The rum is half gone. And somewhere, one-handed and toothless, a pirate hums a lullaby he barely remembers. In the darkness, there's no rank, no gold, no revenge, only aching limbs, beating hearts, shared breath. And maybe that's all healing really is. Not grand miracles, but the quiet act of being there, of handing someone a citrus slice, of listening to the screams without looking away, of stitching, even when your own hands shake. So if tonight you feel a little broken, tired, frayed, patched together with string and hope, just know that you're in good company. History is full of the damaged, and it's the damaged who taught us how to mend. Now drift. Let the sails fade into silence. Let the creaks and whispers become your lullaby. Let the ghosts of peg-legged healers and hammock surgeons keep watch as you sleep. You're safe. You're whole, even if only in pieces. Sweet dreams, shipmate.